And we're recording. Welcome to the October 29th, 2018 Kubernetes SIG Apps. This is Monday. Let's see. Let me get the meeting minutes and go ahead and share them here. There's our file, and then there's the 29th, which we are recording now. And my name is Matt Farina. I'll be chairing today. Alongside, I think Ken is also on, and he'll be co-chairing. Adnan might join us as well. Today, we didn't have any announcements or any demos. Did anybody have any announcements that they wanted to share? I guess the one announcement that I'll share that isn't exactly related, but is big news, and again, is that IBM is in the process of purchasing Red Hat. And so some of our Red Hatters may not be here today. I am sure they've got lots of internal things going on.
I have one, if I can. This is Joe Thompson. I work for Mesosphere, and some of you may have seen last week we released version 112 of DCOS, which includes our high-density multi-Kubernetes product. So that's definitely worth your time to check out. I don't want to go on and on, but as far as we know, it is the only system that allows you to run multiple Kubernetes clusters sharing bare metal nodes.
Interesting. Cool. All right. And if anybody wants to help me with notes, by the way, feel free. Joe, if you wanted to add that to the announcements, please feel free. So with that, we can get right into the discussion topics.
Okay. Oh. Yeah, just Joe, it would be really interesting. Do you guys think you could come and give a demo of that?
I'm sure we could. I don't know if it's necessarily relevant to SIG Apps specifically, but I'm sure we could put together something.
It would be interesting to see how Kubernetes is managed by an application by another, as an application by another container orchestrator, and how Mesos and Kubernetes can kind of play nice together as one being kind of the workload orchestrator and the other one being, kind of the data center resource provisioner.
Yeah, let me take that back to my product people. I'm sure we have something that I can bring in, in like 2 weeks or something.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks for the ask.
But doesn't it sound more like a SIG cluster lifecycle type topic?
If Joe does it well here, I'm sure he could go over there and give it as well. This kind of thing is something that is probably worth maybe showing off more than once around the community. So different people can pick up and learn from it and see what's going on. And I'm sure Joe and Mesos wouldn't mind pitching it more than once either.
Big grin there.
But yes, it would be, that's a good idea for cluster lifecycle. Thank you for pointing that out. So with that, we have our discussion topics. We alternate weeks between developer tools and then the workloads API. And this week is one of our developer tools weeks. Did anybody have anything that they wanted to talk about in relation specifically to developer tools? I didn't actually have anything specifically lined up. It's just normally one of our slots for this. I will take silence as not having anything. If somebody does have something they want to talk about specifically with developer tools, which is something we probably need to get more into in the near future here, because the Kubernetes is hard thing in some of the circles I've been in has been rearing their heads. Its ugly head again. People are getting a little bit, it's a bit of work. There's a lot of platforms you can package something up and know what you're doing and just get it deployed and work in minutes. And with Kubernetes, it's not that easy. And I found that rearing its head again. And so it's probably something worth us talking about. How do we make it a little easier? But with that being said, if we don't have any specific topics, Ken, did you want to talk application CRD controller and app status? Are you there, Ken? You're muted.
I'm there, but getting Zoom to work in our conference rooms requires some technical finagling, so unmuting can be a non-trivial ordeal. So, yeah, application status. So we're going to open up a proposal on the repo for how we think status should be computed, and we've kind of run it by a bunch of people in terms of, from an architectural perspective, looking at resources the correct way. Kind of what we're thinking now is that for the first cut, we'll generally support status for those resources that are well known, like deployment, workload resources, deployment pod, replica set, replication controller, stateful set, and daemon set. The kind of hairier bit is how are we going to communicate status from CRDs, which is kind of the last piece that we're thinking through. And I don't think for the first cut, we're going to be supporting CRDs that are aggregating other workloads, just because there is no best practice around it right now. And I think that's what we're trying to come out with. We'd like to get the application controller and the status computation in within, well, basically before the Christmas holiday. We're not tied to the Kubernetes release cycle, but we're kind of targeting that for our own metrics. And we're close to being ready to accept feedback from the community. So when Barney opens the PR, I'll announce it at SIG Apps, and hopefully we get good review on it and good feedback so we do the right thing the first time around. Then going into the next iteration, we'll have to probably extend it to support whatever the correct interpretation for CRD status is. Not all CRDs we think will even have status, because you can actually just use it as structured data, and doing a review of the way CRDs are being used in the community, that's not an uncommon thing. But it also is very frequently used for like a custom workload controller, like etcd operator or vault operator. And in that case, we want to try to come up with a good way for everyone to report status in a similar way. And as another outcome of this, we'll probably go back and review the workloads API status computations and try to make them a little bit more consistent. That might include doing things like adding conditions for stateful set and adding conditions for daemon set. We added the condition field prior to V1, but we didn't actually add any conditions because we weren't sure about computing them. We also had a long conversation about whether conditions were the right abstraction in the general case, and decided to keep them for deployment and then add them. As we've added them, we should probably start adding a readiness condition in the same way that deployment has one, is what we're thinking.
So the ultimate outcome is you could deploy an application with, say, maybe something that is running as a stateful set and something else that is running as a deployment, and you could see when the whole thing is up and when the whole thing is down by looking at the whole status for a particular application.
Yeah, ready and unready, and there are a few other interesting computations that we're kind of debating about whether they make sense. So like ready would just basically mean that you can actually take traffic and that your network is configured and the workload is up and functional. Settled might be something like, think about how deployment has men availability before it reports readiness. So settled means that you're actually not updating anything, you're at the right version of the application, and you're also ready to take traffic.
Is this mandatory, the status changes? The question is more from like the existing operators, do they need to change in order to use this, or
we're trying to make you wouldn't have to change in order to use it, but we're trying to come up with a standard way that everyone can use it and report status as a part of an application. But you wouldn't be mandatory to opt into now.
Okay.
So we're trying to make the criteria we're trying to lower the barrier to entry as low as possible while still being useful.
Yeah, so if I understand it right, there's a number of different ways that status is being reported today. It's kind of inconsistent. And so to build something that reads other statuses and then reports up an overall status is a little bit difficult due to just the legacy inconsistency. And so we're trying to come up with how we could come up with some patterns that people could consistently do things that make it easier to surface overall status, right?
Right. So like deployment basically reports its readiness directly. It has a condition that basically says, I'm ready. Stateful set and daemon set, they don't really have that at all. But there are ways you can tell what readiness means. I think semantically, there was general agreement on when a deployment is ready. Stateful set's probably a little bit harder because, so is it, I mean, like the easiest thing you could do is say like, it's ready if all of the replicas are running and fully available. But the question is that the right semantic? And then for daemon set, is readiness really, I have a pod running on every node I'm supposed to, and as nodes come and leave, how does that affect the readiness, right? Like, these are kind of the questions that we wanted to answer before we added those types of conditions to the workloads API. So as it is now, we're just going to interpret the status as is without adding the condition directly inside of the workloads API. And then in the next coming releases, we'll probably issue some PRs and proposals for feedback with respect to maybe adding readiness to the workloads APIs other than deployment.
Question about that. Is there a possibility that that could be made user configurable so that I can say, I want this daemon set to show up as ready when any of the pods are ready, versus I don't want it to show up as ready until all of them are ready?
I mean, like I could see us adding a readiness threshold.
Yeah, and that would be the other thing too. Sometimes it would be nice to be able to say, this daemon set is ready when like any 3 are ready, or this stateful set is ready when any 5 are ready, or whatever.
Yeah, I can see us adding a readiness threshold, but ideally, I mean, ultimately, I'm not sure. In talking about it, we aren't necessarily sure that like there's a huge benefit to being able to say that something's ready when it's under replicated. Because ideally, if the declarative intent is 5 pods, you want all of them to be ready, right? And for the reporting of status, it's not like pod readiness where it affects the network programming. It's really just communicating to the end user that it's ready. For stateful sets, they tend to be much smaller than deployments anyway, and daemon sets can launch a lot of things in parallel. And they're only kind of sensitive to the number of nodes in the cluster as opposed to being sensitive to like actual replication configuration and the user's declarative intent. Deployment seems the one where readiness threshold would make the most sense, and we don't do it there.
Well, and readiness threshold maybe not for a daemon set, because that is kind of all or nothing. It's like an any or none. But I have seen, and this is arguably kind of an abuse of the daemon set, but I have seen daemon sets that are fronted by a service. So as soon as the first daemon set pod comes up, it's effectively ready. There's nothing stateful about it. It's just for whatever reason the decision was made that this needs to run on every node, but as long as any of them are ready, we're ready to accept work.
But so the readiness semantic that we have for deployment is slightly different, right? Like what we're saying is not just ready to accept work, but fully replicated, meaning that we can accept work at the level that the user has requested. And it gets even more complicated given now that we have auto scaling.
Yeah.
So maybe even reviewing deployment is a worthwhile exercise in determining if readiness for deployment still has the semantics that we want it to, given changes in the ecosystem and how it's evolved.
Maybe we need a SIG readiness.
It would only be a working group.
We don't need any more SIGs, let's be honest. We've got enough meeting. But yeah, figuring out readiness though. And I think the application controller is a nice place to do it because we're going to be looking at readiness across a bunch of things, both built-in controllers and, well, CRDs and CRs. And so it's a nice place to kind of look at it here and just see what the mess is and maybe try to plot a pragmatic path forward to help us make this simpler or to try to deal with some of that mess we have today. So I like that. I do have, Ken, one thing we should probably do before this PR goes in. We have 0 releases right now. We should probably do a 0.1.0 release.
Yeah, I'll do the release this week. I was meant to do it last week, but got hung up by a bunch of other things.
Yeah, we should have this tagged in case folks need to go back and forth or something, so it's easy.
I'm actually going to drop 2 tags back to back probably. I'll tag the one that was the one that basically we've already tacitly released. And then I want to update to the latest version of Kubernetes Builder.
Yeah, there's an issue for that.
Yeah. I think there's someone who's trying to get a PR together, but they're struggling a little bit, and I've been kind of help pointing them in the right direction. So hopefully we can get that PR in too.
Okay. Yeah, that would be good. Okay. No, I like the app status more now, especially since it is hard to get status on everything easily. That would be a good first use for the controller.
And then one other thing that, well, actually, it's not for me. Someone had a report that they were trying to use the application CRD with the new SetBased selectors, and they were having issues with it, but I wasn't able to reproduce it. I was kind of curious if anyone else had seen that problem. My intuition is that they set their SetBased selector up in a way that didn't match the actual things they were selecting. I'll take silence as no.
Is there an issue on this already?
I don't know if the guy created an issue. You reached out to me via email.
Wait, is it this one? No, that's match expressions.
Yeah, no, that's the same thing.
Is it? Or match labels is insufficient? Okay. No, I haven't looked at this yet. I just saw it came in.
Yeah, I tried to, it seemed to work for me. And in theory, it uses a label selector that is basically the same as everyone else, which support set and legacy-based selection. I think kind of the other feedback we got was that why are we using the app label? And it was basically, that was a recommendation that the app dev working group came out with for labeling applications in a consistent way so they'd be usable across tools. So
yeah. Okay. No, this makes sense. Yeah, I'll take a look at this too. I haven't seen this yet. I'm a little behind on my application stuff, but I can catch up now. All right. Anything else we should talk about in reference to the application CRD and controller? All right, I'll take silence as nothing. And then the last one was one that I just added here earlier today. All right, so one of the selling points that a lot of folks have for Kubernetes is the idea of portability. I can take my Kubernetes application and I can run it in AWS, I can run it in GKE, I can go run it in AKS, you know, I can move it all over the place. I could use DigitalOcean, I can move it all over. But the reality is a lot of folks use SaaS services, right? They're not going to run their own MySQL or MariaDB cluster. A lot of times they use a database as a service and just query it and get their API endpoints and be ready to go. Well, all the vendors have their own APIs for all of these things, and they even have certain nuances to them as well in how some of this works. So what do you know, and end users want to be able to port their things. Portability is one of the selling points that people are excited about with Kubernetes because you can port it, but we don't really have that. And for a while, quite some time, we've had the Kubernetes Service Catalog as an incubator project working to try to do this. And it's been the vendors trying to come together to work this out. But unfortunately, it's not doing that well these days. And it's not where it needs to be, and you don't really have good support across clouds. And so we don't really have that portability, and I don't know if the service catalog, which is built on the open service broker, is going to become something viable in the next few years. And I've been talking to some folks who are much more intimately involved in this stuff than I am. And so that's why I wanted to open up and start talking about some of the possibilities that we could have, like what is it, and how we could address this.
So you're talking about open service broker, the OSB?
Open service broker or service catalog, which builds on it.
Okay.
So the service catalog, it's the Kubernetes service catalog project.
Right. So I think one of the issues for GKE, we had an implementation of the service catalog for GCP services that people could install on their cluster and use an OSB use basically an OSB to provision and bind to services that were backed by Google Cloud stuff like GCS and so forth. And I think the discovery was that people don't feel like that's a cloud native way to interface with Kubernetes. So going back a ways, you have to remember, like, so when Pivotal Cloud Foundry was first launched, you couldn't run anything stateful on it, right? Like that was just a non-starter. So in order to provision credentials and coordinates for you to bind to services that existed off cluster that ran stateful things like databases or Redis or any of those things, they came up with the service broker model. And the service broker model we have is almost, in the Kubernetes service broker, is almost the exact same thing as the PCF model.
And that's actually because it's built on that, right? They took the service broker from Cloud Foundry. They made something called the open service broker, so anybody could use it. And then the Kubernetes service catalog used the open service broker to do their stuff. So it's quite literally the same.
It is, but the problem that I think conceptually people kind of had with it is that so pieces of it are very declarative, but the workflow for actual provisioning and binding is very imperative, right? And then there's like no automatic way to get coordinates injected into your stuff. There's no automatic way to get secrets and credentials injected into your stuff. The experience wasn't everything that people wanted. So I think what I've seen people doing, like particularly there's a new thing out from AWS, which has gotten somewhat mixed feedback, that presents AWS services as CRDs that interface directly with your Kubernetes cluster. And it supports like SNS, SQS, Dynamo tables, so forth and so on, right? So
exactly. Like, in fact, that's the reason that got me here, was because AWS released this, and it kind of goes this way, and it's built on operators, right? But it's AWS only. And if I remember right, AWS never really got involved in the service catalog. And I understand vendor motivations and things like that, but this is AWS only, which comes back to, okay, now you've got a more Kubernetes native way maybe to get AWS things, but you don't have a vendor neutral or a way, because I can't take those same CRDs and port them to GKE. I can't take those same CRDs and port them to Azure, because it's not going to work there. This is AWS specific. And that gets us back into the vendor lock-in, the specific vendor world, where maybe Kubernetes can run my custom workloads, but if I go for a SaaS, even the common ones, I'm back into my single vendor, which actually removes the portability idea, which is what a number of end users want.
And that was like some of the critical feedback that I saw given to this project, was that, great, another way to lock me in. Now, even for my portable stuff, I'm locked into AWS, thanks. But I don't feel like that was the developer's intention. He just wanted to make it easier for people to turn up stuff and use it inside of their clusters. And to be fair, like for Dynamo, there is no, if you're using Dynamo or like Cloud Bigtable or one of the services that only exists on a particular vendor implementation, there is no notion of what portability might look like. But one thing that might be interesting, to me at least, is there are some basic fundamentals that Kubernetes abstracts for networking, compute, and storage. Extending that to some other fundamentals that are generally ubiquitous across cloud provider implementations might be a useful thing to do. So like I could imagine a single CRD that represents interaction, single set of CRDs that implements interaction with object storage, because object storage is fairly ubiquitous. And even for on-prem installations, you can get like Dell or EMC appliances that pretty much implement S3 compatible API for object storage. Or for particularly RDBMSs, there may be some features that you can get on one cloud that you can't get on another, but all of them support a managed offering for turning up a relational database management system. So
yeah, and quite honestly, a lot of what people do is the standard shared services. MySQL compliant API usage, that is still huge, right? And there's a bunch of services that are similar between them. And so I'm just wondering, how much, if you're a non-vendor person, how much of this a big deal if you're not at one of the major clouds to be able to have this?
I just wanted to add a couple of points from my perspective on the service operator. I do feel like it has certain benefit to the user from the ease of use perspective, because you would directly instantiate basically AWS services that you read about in AWS docs. You don't have to transpose the model of a given AWS service to service catalog model, where there are some additional things you suddenly have to care about, right? So that's like kind of the direct approach is better than abstraction here with respect to ease of use, because you could just basically copy paste something from like a CloudFormation example or whatever.
Yeah, but at the same time, folks want a certain amount of, what I'm curious about is the amount of portability folks want in being able to run this, because a lot of folks want to use a SaaS, and I understand it may not be the cloud native way to do it, but what you end up doing is you end up punting in the operations to somebody else. If I don't have to operate my own MySQL, then I don't have to worry about that. I can focus on my own business logic, which is what a lot of folks want to do. So they punt to SaaS services that scale, have teams of people behind them, and they just pay a little itty bitty cost to get in on this. It's the economies of scale. And right, so it's not always just about, okay, well, there's a more cloud native way where I can run it myself. Part of the whole idea is I don't want to run it myself because I want somebody else to deal with that problem, and I just want to deal with a working service. And so, and a lot of these are common services across different providers. They may have some nuances to them, but a lot of folks don't even take advantage of those. They're just going with the basics straight away that they could run themselves. They just don't want to. And so I think that there is a space in the portability realm that folks are going to want. Now, for a lot of the newer stuff, we're getting away from that because a lot of the open specs were years ago, and we don't see as many open specs these days. A lot of it is more, I'm going to release my API, and it'll be different from everybody else's. We're in a little bit more of the age of the proprietary API, but still a lot of those open APIs are widely used. And so how do we work with that? Because some things won't and other things will. And I, for one, I need portability, and I'm looking for others who need it.
Yeah, I think so. Useful I mean, my previous comments were mostly concerning very specific things like DynamoDB, right? But the other thing I wanted to add, and that's the last thing I really want to say here, is that it may be a good idea to consider to narrow down the scope to, as we mentioned, object storage and perhaps something that is MySQL-like. So having a few options where you could create a MySQL database in Google Cloud and Amazon and see how those match up, and having a very simple CRD that lets you do that would be nice. And I don't think it requires an open service broker kind of abstraction to just do that.
But that was one of the things that I actually really liked about open service broker. Like there were a lot of different things you could do with that interface if it had taken off and like become more popular and that project had grown. So you could, for instance, have your SQL databases running in one namespace in your cluster, and your service broker could actually turn up instances of the database on top of Kubernetes, right? And you could swap that implementation out, or even have a coexisting implementation that actually ran as a managed service on a particular cloud provider. And the object model had a notion of being able to capture those categories of services and tiers of services and all of that inside of it. But that is kind of what made it complicated to use and not super like cloud native. And it just seems like the community is more engaged with API extensions via CRDs and API extension servers in terms of how they want to model this interaction. But it does lose some of the nice generality and portability and being able to set up an abstraction that easily is implemented either in cluster or out of cluster.
So one of the things that caught my attention in this, though, is with if I understand it right, and somebody can correct me, if you're using Service Catalog and Open Service Broker, it required the providers to have the Open Service Broker APIs to do things, right? So AWS would have to go do those APIs, and Google would have to go do those APIs, and Azure would have to go do those APIs, and DigitalOcean would have to go do those APIs, and Alibaba would have to go do those APIs, and it required the providers to be in on that game. And I know Google and Microsoft with Azure, they went in and they invested a lot into this, but I don't think AWS did, if I remember right. And that was a pain point. And I think it might work now, but finding docs and getting this stuff really up and running over there. I tried it out a few months ago, and everything just fell over in AWS when I was trying it. And so the nice things with just using the baked-in APIs and using maybe a controller and operator is it removes the vendors from having to be in the loop and allows you to do everything in sort of like user space. I'm air quoting here, right? Air quoting user space, to where the end users can go off and solve the problem they need without the vendors being in the loop. I'm wondering if it kind of shifts the dynamic on where work has to happen.
I guess, but you could easily implement the service catalog for a cloud provider as a shim and just have a mediation layer that manages the interaction for, let's say you wanted to do it on AWS for S3, for instance, right? Like there was no, if the community wanted to implement it, the service providers wouldn't really be able to stop them. It's just like a matter of, do they individually want to invest in implementing a broker for their particular cloud? That's kind of up to them. But it wouldn't, if the community wanted it bad enough, it probably would have happened anyway, without respect to that.
Okay, I'm going to go dig a little bit more into the open service broker and see what's going on over there. Because I, for one, need the portability. And I'm looking for, if anybody else is interested in the portability, I'll be chasing this one down for a little while. Feel free to reach out if you want to be looped in on it, because I'm going to chase this one down. Yeah. But I think we do need some good stuff. And it directly relates to apps, because it's the apps that are always using the services, which is why I even brought it here. Okay. Well, that's what we had on our agenda for today. So now it's open discussion. Do we have any open discussion topics? I'm going to take silence as we don't, which means everybody gets a little over 20 minutes of their day back. Thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful week, and we'll be back here next week.